Well, today we're going to deal with a topic, and I'll get to this in a minute, but I changed my Twitter account name because I got too many complaints that nobody could spell Malaldo, which means not enough Christians are reading C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, but I'll deal with that at a different time. Today we're going to be looking at marital breakdown, causes and prevention, and probably a little bit broader look than what you're used to. And before I get into this, though, there's a couple things that I want to say just to contextualize this. The first thing is that the Protestant Reformation essentially was responsible for the legalization of divorce. There's no doubt about it. That's appropriate because some divorce should be allowed to happen. The Protestants also recognized that the laws regarding divorce and remarriage should probably be broader than the strict requirements of Scripture, given that many citizens were not real Christians except just by baptism, and they knew that. And like Moses, they believed that trying to force people to stay in something that they're not equipped to stay in, even if there's not a biblical grounds for them to leave that relationship, may ultimately do more harm than good. In other words, if they're not embracing Christ, if they're not embracing the Lordship of Christ, if they're not embracing the Word of God, if they're not participating in the grace that God gives, it might be artificial to force them to stay in a relationship that they really don't want to stay in. And so they recognized the need for legal divorce. They also recognized that the Catholic system of annulments, which is basically these constant declarations that a true marriage never took place, were only available to people on the basis of money. And they oftentimes came up with very contrived reasons to say that whatever marriage these people had entered into in the first place was not a real marriage, which then just twisted the daylights out of everybody's understanding of marriage. The one Protestant church to pick that up were the Anglicans, but the Anglicans decided that on the one hand they were going to get rid of all these fake annulments, but on the other hand they weren't going to allow divorce either, except by an act of Parliament, which really restricted it to the rich and powerful, and made the situation in many ways worse. Nevertheless, under the Protestant reformers, their basic understanding is that divorce is a rare and regrettable outcome based on egregious fault. The notion of a unilateral ending of a marriage, that if one partner is unhappy, they could just leave the relationship, and that there would be no attempt to discern fault, is something that didn't occur to them because fault always exists. And marriage ought to be more binding than a used car contract, which now it is not. If you agree to buy a used car and you change your mind, you have to be released by that contract by the other party. And if they say, I'm not going to release you, you can't be released. Our current system of divorce is nothing that they would have encompassed, even granting a certain amount of mercy towards the non-Christian population, that the strict requirements of the Scriptures should perhaps not be applied by the state. And Martin Luther was one of the people that argued that. So that's the first thing I want to do. The second thing to contextualize this is that when you teach on this, as with so many other areas, you realize that out there in your audience are those whose parents got divorced, who themselves got divorced, and if you really teach this honestly, many of them will conclude that the decision that they made was not a good one. Where do I engage that? I engage this. God started with me where I was, not where I should have been. God starts with you where you are, not where you should have been. You start where you are, and you proceed from that point forward. That's what the mercy of God means. If you're on your third marriage, start where you are. If you got a divorce and your children were hurt by it, start where you are. When we worked with men in the Bronx who'd made a total mess of their lives and were oftentimes completely alienated from their children, weren't providing child support, hadn't visited their own children in years, what we said was, start where you are. Start where you are. Call your child up. Begin to establish a relationship. Try to carve out some money to help out your former wife. Start where you are. And so in that sense, that's just very important. It's the same thing with everything else we deal with, right? Were you sexually active outside of marriage? Start where you are. Did you cohabit 3 times before you finally settled down with the spouse you now have? And recognizing that hurts you. Start where you are. Start where you are. God is a merciful God. Start where you are. But starting where you are does not mean excusing where you were. It means embracing repentance and the forgiveness of God. That's what I had to do. That's what all of us have to do. And so in that sense, we start where we are. And it's important to remember that as we move forward. Because on the one hand, the church is not going to make progress if we don't start getting serious about marital vows. But we're entering a mess. And it's partly a mess of our own making. It's not just their mess, it's our mess. Own it. But let's start where we are, with the grace and the mercy of God. Okay. I love this quote from Martin Luther. For trouble here is owing solely to the fact that men do not regard marriage according to God's word as his work and ordinance. Do not pay regard to his will, that he has given to everyone his spouse to keep her and to endure for his sake the discomforts that married life brings with it. They regard it as nothing else than a mere human secular affair, with which God has nothing to do. Therefore, one soon becomes tired of it, and if it does not go as we wish, doesn't this sound kind of contemporary? We soon begin to separate and change. Then God nevertheless so orders it that we thereby make it no better. As it then generally happens if one wants to change and improve matters, and no one wants to carry his cross, but have everything perfectly convenient and without discomfort. That he gets an exchange in which he finds twice or 10 times more discomfort, not alone in this matter, but in all other matters. Martin Luther. Sounds pretty contemporary, doesn't it? Okay. The 20th century rise of modern divorce, and we're going to be drinking from a fire hose. The first stage of this, if we go to the 20th century, was what sociologists called the democratization of divorce. I've already described that when you went into the 20th century, thanks primarily to Protestantism, you had divorce available, but you had to find fault, and you typically had to have money to make it happen. And many people did not. By the way, poor people did get divorced, but they generally did it through desertion. I'm heading out on the train. I'm heading out down the highway. You ain't going to see me no more. Look at all the blues songs. That's the song, right? The song is, I hear my train a-coming. That train was the train of getting out of Dodge, leaving your wife with the kids, and disappearing into the general population. And then she was welcome if she wanted to take a common law husband. That was the poor man's divorce. It still, by the way, is in many cases. About 7% of separations are permanent. They don't lead to a divorce. They just are separations that exist forever. Okay. But the democratization of divorce was it moved to something that the working and middle class people found accessible, and they did. It moved from the guidance of religious figures and ministers to secular experts in guidance. It became the province of lawyers and psychologists, not the province of ordained ministers and priests. Still, they regarded divorce as bad, especially if children were involved, unless it clearly ended a terrible situation. And during this period, the divorce rate looked something like this. And I draw what's called a regression line on this so you can see the overall line. But this is the 1890s. And then this is what we had in 1940. By the way, this little dip, the only reason this little dip occurred was because people stuck together in the Great Depression to survive. And then when the Great Depression began to alleviate, they started getting divorced again. That's what happened there. That's what that was. Okay. Over time, however, what happened was, man, my bullet points don't load properly. Over time, people began developing overheated expectations about life was supposed to give them. Prosperity is one of the most destructive things for marriage because it makes people think that wants are actually need. I need a new car. I need a better job. I need a private office. I need 2 weeks vacation. For me now, it's I need to be able to go to the Bahamas on a cruise the way all the people on Facebook get to do. I need it. And literally what happened is a lot of marriages began ending over financial conflicts, not because they couldn't eat, but because they couldn't go on Bahamian cruises or trips to Paris, because people actually began to believe that they deserved those things. By the way, advertising played a big role in that, right? Because you constantly have shoved in front of your face what you ought to have but don't have. You deserve a break today. No, you don't. You don't deserve a break. By the way, you deserve hell, but that's between you and God.
That'd be hard to serve.
Yeah. You got to serve somebody, says Bob Dylan. You may serve the devil, or you may serve the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. Okay, you look for ways to normalize and destigmatize divorce. They were trying to come up with ways to make divorce okay because they wanted to do it. And so we don't want anybody to experience shame. The other thing is that female employment grew, and believe it or not, that didn't just make it easier for women to get out of the relationship, it made it easier for husbands to get out of the relationship because the man could say, if I leave here, she won't starve, she can get a job. And so psychologically, it was easier for him to walk away from that relationship. Also easier for him to walk away from the requirements of child support. Because psychologically, it was easier for both people. It didn't just make it easier for the women. Rising female employment made it easier for the men. Okay. And then we began having what was called the therapeutic revolution, memorialized by a sociologist named Philip Rieff in a very, very powerfully influential book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. We had what was known as, again, my bullet points aren't loading properly, expressive divorce, just like we have expressive marriage, therapeutic divorce, just like we had therapeutic marriage. It was tied to a similar view of marriage, that divorce is about individual fulfillment, happiness, self-actualization. If the marriage is limiting me, I should be able to get out of it. Do you remember the sitcoms in the 70s that show the brave woman leaving her husband with the 2 kids and establishing life? That was where, who was that woman, that really pretty actress who married Eddie Van Halen? Yeah, One Day at a Time. One Day at a Time was all about breaking loose, right? There was also the one that, who was she? Was it Marlo Thomas was in that one? That girl. The idea really wasn't that the husband was a brutal beast who was cheating on them and beating them. It was about that they weren't able to be themselves. And so you get out of the marriage so that you can be yourself. This is the triumph of the therapeutic. And what it did was it took all the effects of prosperity and it put gasoline on it. Philip Rieff talked about new needs being endlessly generated. Every day there's a new need, something else that you just got to have. And I was on the way to church this morning, and Harry's Razors just keeps hitting me. I think it's because I'm a conservative and Ben Shapiro sponsors them, and so I end up on and then all of a sudden, the next thing you know, I'm getting flooded with Harry Razors. Well, I've got a drawer packed with perfectly adequate blades at home. This can take me probably a half a year to get through them, but suddenly, I found myself buying Harry Razors, and luckily I stopped just before the end, and I thought, I don't really need them now. You know, maybe in 6 months I'll go to Harry's Razors, but you know, I don't really need a smoother shave. This is kind of working all right. My wife's okay with it. I think it's good. Nevertheless, what's 15 bucks when a baby face is in view? And a monthly drop-off of the latest gel and post-shave spritzer. My dad would have found my life shocking because his life consisted, when he was a kid at least, of play clothes and church clothes. And a lot of patching and darning. Not me, baby. I need at least 3 separate pairs of pants a week, a fresh shirt every day. Now, by the way, my coworkers are probably glad I do that, but nevertheless, I don't really need it. By the way, you do need a Grove City College education, or your children need it. I will say that. That you need. The Uses of Faith after Freud. What he basically said is that the psychologists have replaced the ministers, and our new faith, our new religion, is a religion of the self. It's the religion of therapy. It's the religion of personal fulfillment and happiness, self-actualization. What's that? That would have been the 50s, roughly. His work has been has been very, very influential in the marriage understanding. The entire book, Habits of the Heart, by Robert Bell and Company in 1983, that dealt with the impact of therapeutic individualist mind on our lack of ability to form real lasting attachments, is pure reef and Tocqueville. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, pure reef, not Tocqueville. You dump anything that gets in your way. And so you're basically, your evaluations are based on your feelings, the dictates of relativism and self-fulfillment. No-fault divorce is the logical legal outcome of this. If one person is unhappy, and that's all that needs to happen, they should be allowed out, and nobody should make a judgment about this. No judge should make a judgment about the decision that one person in many cases is making. By the way, in at least 3/4 of unhappy marriages, only one person is unhappy. The divorce is viewed as a healthy response to marital dissatisfaction. Okay, so we move on from this. And this is what divorce looked like here. This is the 1960s, by the way. Do you see that the effects of the 1960s, a period of time in which the United States was the most prosperous and healthy nation in human history? In human history. Was harder on marriage than anything else. This was the post-World War II spike. Lots of Dear John letters, right, and decimated lives, men coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder. And it spiked a lot of marriages, but then things got better for a while once people had kind of absorbed that disaster up until about 1980. Then the divorce rate began to decline. By the way, this is a very good divorce rate. I use this throughout my book. Divorces per 1,000 married women, because unmarried people don't get divorces. It's kind of weird how that works. That becomes important in a minute. Nevertheless, the 60s revolution decimated America. Is the divorce rate declining? Be careful with this. First of all, government data underestimates divorce for a number of different reasons, including, by the way, that it typically doesn't include separations. But virtually, not always, because you probably know cases where this has been resolved well, but virtually always, or almost always, separation is either divorce in process or it's permanent. And it's particularly permanent among the lower class. So when you don't include separations, you really underestimate the rates of marital dissolution. But nevertheless, there are other wrinkles as well. And most experts say that government data underestimated divorce more since about 1990. So in other words, during the period of a lot of this so-called decline in divorce, the government data was actually undercounting divorce more than it had before. So part of that decline is simply an artifact of measurement. The next probability, and I already mentioned this, is that it doesn't include separations. Separations is a poor man's divorce. And I know, for example, one couple that have been separated, I think, under a legal agreement for roughly 10 or 15 years. Probably wrong about that, but that's not that uncommon. Okay. It's not true for all age groups. For example, divorce among the middle-aged is rising. And most of the rising divorce among people in their 40s and 50s, that's called, by the way, the gray divorce revolution. Sorry, guys who are gray. Is actually because that's their second or third marriage ending after about 5 or 6 years. And remarriages are more likely to end in divorce than first marriages. So it's not that long. A lot of the media said, oh, just because you've been married 30 years, don't feel safe. You know, people in their 50s and 60s are now getting divorced at epidemic levels. Yeah, but those divorces, if you look at them, are second or third marriages, not first marriages. If you're in your first marriage like I am, and you've been married over 20 or 30 years, your risk of divorce, now that doesn't mean you don't have one, but it's very low. Second, and finally, and this is one of the huge ones, is that cohabitation is up and marriage is way down. So a lot of the instability in and remember, I mentioned this before, cohabiting couples are as likely to be raising children as married couples. Cohabiting couples are as likely to be raising children as married couples. But all that instability is off the records because to get divorced, you have to get married. If you don't get married, you can't get divorced. So this is a really huge problem. And here's what I say in my book. Much of the general decline in divorce is because fewer people are getting married. One has to get married to get divorced. This also means that those who get married are a select group, less likely to get divorced in the first place. Meanwhile, people are increasingly living together and having children outside of wedlock. This involves a lot of relational instability. As Kennedy and Ruggles-Riley point out, because cohabiting unions are more unstable than marriages, we expect that the rapid rise of cohabitation among the young will neutralize any decline of divorce. With high levels of cohabitation, we underestimate things like how many children are watching their parents break up, how many households are dissolving, and so on, just by looking at formal divorce. Now, I don't go into detail on this here, but in my book, I go into details on something that the liberals have been very reluctant to talk about. And that is what really happens to children after divorce in modern America. I tell you what really happens to children. Normally what really happens to children is that their mother moves in with somebody. They're now living with a live-in boyfriend, usually more than one. Following that, there's a marriage which actually has a higher rate of breaking up, so it exceeds a 50% divorce rate, partly because they exist. Because the presence of those children actually makes that divorce more likely. So the fact is that this isn't so true at Grove City College, but the average college professor is teaching classrooms full of kids who've experienced a string of relationships between the time they were born and the time they went to college, and they are burned out. And that's one of the reasons they're not getting married. They are afraid of it. They are burned out. Easy divorce is now accepted socially. There's very little social pressure to inhibit divorce. If anything, when couples encounter marital difficulties, friends and families will often go right to maybe you should get divorced as a solution. That's oftentimes the first conversation they'll have with you. This is the percent agreeing that it should be more difficult to obtain a divorce. And notice that for a while, it was over 50%, but now it's been dropping steadily. Divorce is usually the best solution when a couple can't seem to work out their marriage problems. Does everybody see that that statement is a blank check for divorce? It's usually the best solution to marriage problems. Holy Toledo. And yet look at the percentage that agree with this, including in 2014, let me see. "48% of self-professed evangelicals and over 40% of self-professed evangelicals who say they are in church every Sunday." Find out what the people in your pews think. Find out what they think. And this has been divorce versus never divorce, but I want you to see something because it's one of the few encouraging things about millennials. Does everybody see that millennials like divorce less than the older people? You know why? They've suffered from it. They don't care how many pundits get on national television and say that everybody is resilient. They're not so resilient. And if they haven't suffered from it, they've watched their friends suffer from it. People just don't really know the reality of it. So for example, I was sitting before a major cultural event at the college, I was sitting waiting for the event to start, doing what sociologists do, namely eavesdropping on the conversation the students behind me were having. But here's the conversation they were having. And by the way, the statistics show that this is extremely common. "I'm not going to be able to come back next year." Why? "Because my parents got divorced. My father's new wife does not want him paying for my tuition, and my stepfather won't pay for it either." Her step-siblings were getting tuition. She was not. That is not unusual. And by the way, not only is that financially wrecking her, does it take a rocket science to see what that's done to her emotionally? That the moral authority of her father is gone. You know, here's the thing that a lot of people don't realize is this, and I try to get this across. And again, for those who've been through this experience, start where you are. Start where you are. I had to start where I was. If I leave my wife for another woman tomorrow, the damage that I do for my children is astronomically greater than if I die right now of a heart attack. First of all, financially, they'll be taken care of. They won't be if I leave her. But the other thing is that my wife can sit down with my children and say, "Your daddy did not want to go. He did not leave you. And by the way, I didn't leave you, I left your mother" doesn't work on kids. Especially when you get remarried and your wife wants a real husband and father. Your new wife wants a real husband and father in her home. And you can have the best intentions in the world. There's only so much that go around. There's only so much money, so much time, so much attention, so much emotional energy to go around. If that's you, start where you are. I tell people all the time, I am not interested in thumping my chest or poking my finger in anybody else's chest. I've done too many things I'm ashamed of in my life. The point is to come alongside and say, let's look at reality realistically and let's walk this out together. Let's just walk it out together right where we are. Your pastor, your elders, your fellow church members walking it out. Walk it out. Now, the myth that most divorces solve bad marriages is a basic logical fallacy called the false choice dilemma. There are other alternatives. And yet you would not believe how often I confront this. Dave, you are so cruel, you are so terrible, you encourage people to stay in bad marriages. You want them getting beaten, you want them getting cheated on, you want them coming home day after day and finding their husband half drunk. You don't care about these people at all.
There's a statistic that says an unhappy marriage, if they stay together 5 years later, they're happy.
Almost
Greatly improves the marriage.
almost 3/4 of the time. So the idea that divorce typically involves ending a terrible marriage is not true. First of all, less than 1 out of 3 divorces involve marriages that are viewed as high conflict. And by the way, even in the high conflict marriage, only a subset of those involves physical abuse. High conflict is, for example, defined by Paul Amato and Alan Booth, two very fine family researchers, and secular, by the way, is either violence, physical violence, but also serious and frequent quarreling. So even within that, the number that are actually abusive is actually quite small. The typical divorce does not end in abusive marriage. We know that. Second of all, only 1 in 5 children witness high conflict prior to divorce. By the way, that figure depends on the study. I saw another study that said between 1 out of 5 and 1 out of 4. By the way, if you want to understand the effects of divorce on children, you have to recognize that most children who experience the divorce of their parent, it comes out of left field and hits them upside the head like a ball bat. They weren't miserable. They weren't sitting there every day watching their parents scream at each other. They weren't watching their drunken father beating their mother. They were, in fact, from their point of view, seeing a marriage that was good enough, and they were in a home that was basically stable and more or less happy. There's also, and I don't know if I got into the detail in here, I think we may get to it, so I don't want to jump ahead. Intense conflict post-divorce is frightfully common. So the idea that divorce ends the conflict where there is a lot of conflict isn't really that accurate. In fact, the conflict often takes on contours that are really unbelievable. I have a film that I show my students where they have a family court judge interviewed about divorces in her court. What she says is, they have no idea how much power I end up exercising over the smallest details of their family life. I decide where they stay, when they stay, what they do when they're there. I may make decisions about whether or not the father's allowed to bathe his children or help them get dressed. I may decide whether the mother is or is not allowed to move to get a job, or whether the father is. She said, I now take control over the micro details of their life. And she said, I don't know them at all. I have no relationship with them. And yet they are handing me control over their life, over the smallest details of their life, because they can't handle that themselves. By the way, it also means that when you have Christian attorneys who handle divorces, they really should be handling it differently. They shouldn't be handling it as meat, as money. They should truly be counselors at law. When they're dealing with a divorce that's going to happen, and they should try to spend at least 6 months stopping it from happening. That's what the Christian Legal Society says. They should be managing it for the welfare of the children first, and then the adults, not for the golden ring, the big payout, the custody. In a large study of divorced adults and their children that was sponsored by a prominent law firm in Britain, the law firm said they handled a lot of the divorces in the country of England, and they said, we don't know what's happening to the people that we help get divorced. We want to find out what's happening to them. So they studied over 2,000 married couples and then about the same number of children from divorced homes for a sum total of about, a random sample of about 4,000. About 2,000 kids and about 2,000 couples, which is 4,000 adults. In a large study of divorced adults and their children that was sponsored by a prominent law firm in Britain, 42% of the children, this is post-divorce, saw bad quarrels, 17% violence between their divorced or divorcing parents. About 1 out of 4 children were asked by one parent to lie to the other one, while about half of the parents used the courts to mediate disputes over access and living issues related to their children. The judge was deciding. Half of the parents admitted to drawing out the legal battle to secure a more favorable outcome. 68% confessed to using their children as bargaining tools to get a better outcome. 1 out of 5 said that they tried to make their ex-spouse's experience as unpleasant as possible, even when and if they knew it hurt their children. What about when one of the spouse claims that their marriage is unhappy? 86% of the time, there's no violence in that relationship. The unhappy spouse asked, has your spouse hurt you? No. Physical abuse? No. No violence in the 77% of those that go on to divorce. For those who stayed married, no violence 93% of the time, 5 years later. 3 out of 4 times their spouse is happy with the marriage. The unhappiness is one-sided, and at least one person, and if there are children, is about to be devastated by that decision. Most of the children who experienced a divorce of parents were in a home situation that was working fine for them, and their situation then got worse. And by the way, I have a chapter on this. I've been studying this for years, and the divorce, if they have warning labels on cigarettes, they should have a warning sticker on divorce, because actually divorce is worse for your health than smoking a pack a day. And I'm not making that up. Okay, the longer term trajectory, on average, the subsequent marriages are no happier and less likely to last. Unhappy married people who stick it out mostly see their marriages succeed and improve. The overwhelming majority of couples who choose to stick it out see their marriages improve, and they're happy in 5 years as anybody else's marriage is. Why? First of all, what do? First, you fix the underlying issues. You know, Brent talked about the foxes, I think, that eat away at your marriage. A lot of times the marriage problems are not so-called marriage problems. They're problems with one spouse who has a life-controlling problem, uncontrollable temper, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, pornography addiction. They're workaholics. They're never at home. That in a sense, the ministry to a sin problem that one spouse has fixes the marriage, because that's what needs to happen. And, you know, from what I can see in this church, you have proactive teaching and proactive session, who also are willing to draw on outside experts to help you with your problems. Next, they get good counseling, but what does good counseling look like? Good counseling looks like a counselor that believes that the marriage can and should be saved. Men, particularly in marriage counseling, complain that the marriage counselors are too often value neutral. They refuse to say whether or not the couple should stay together or not. And so they feel like if they want to save the marriage, they don't have an advocate. There's no advocate for saving the marriage. Next, there's oftentimes temporary stress that was aggravating the marriage, and it goes away. And a lot of times people don't really know that. You know, I've been through a couple of nightmare job situations that didn't have an easy solution and just lasted. And you know what? you'd start seeing arguments and difficulties cropping up at home and think, oh, well, we're just not agreeing on that. No, it isn't. You're coming home stressed out of your mind. Your wife's not there for you the way you wish because she's got a screaming 2-year-old. That's life, my friend. And it can be really hard. And a lot of times the people in it don't realize that that's what the problem really is. The problem really isn't their partner. The problem isn't really their marriage. It's the situation they're in that's creating this terrible stress. But this too shall pass, as George Harrison says. And for us, it did, and for many people it does. The next thing is they commit themselves to work hard on their marriage. They make saving their marriage a priority, the number one priority. I know it's probably a little bit schmaltzy, but I know at least one person whose marriage was about to end who told me that the film Fireproof, Kirk Cameron's film Fireproof, turned their marriage around. Because it convinced them that he didn't want to get divorced, that he was responsible for a lot of what was going wrong in that marriage, and that if he wanted to save his family, he had better get busy. The last thing is that, so by the way, here's another lie. It's not always equal parts. You know, divorce is always two-sided. It's always equally, the blame is always equal between the two. I don't know anybody that does marriage counseling who hasn't found in many situations where one person was 90% of the problem. The other huge factor is being deeply committed to the marriage and just as reluctant to consider divorce. In normal unhappiness situation, this strongly and positively increases marriage quality in the long run. This is what Linda Waite says about this in a monograph she put out with some of her social science co-authors called "Does Divorce Make People Happy?" Many happily married spouses have experienced extended periods, typically 2 years or more, of marital unhappiness, often for quite serious reasons. Paul Amato again and Stacy Rogers studied 2,000 married couples for 8 years. What they said was, adopting more favorable attitudes towards divorce appears to undermine marital quality in the long run. Now, divorce risk. We call this average marital risk. The divorce risk is high. We look at average marital risk based on a cohort, everybody married within a certain period of time. About 80% of all divorces will occur in the first 10 to 15 years of marriage. The average marriage ends at 7 years. The average marriage that ends in divorce ends in 7 years. That's the US Census. By the way, that's why premarital counseling is so important, because you're helping people right ahead of the most difficult time in their marriage is when they first get married. And what I mean by that is they separate at 7, and then it takes them a year to work out the paperwork. Remarriages end sooner, and for them it's 6, 7. So if you take a cohort and 4 out of 10 of them have been divorced in 10 to 15 years, and you know the divorce is going to slow down, but there's still going to be more divorce, then you know that the lifetime risk there is about 50%. And that's where 50% divorce rate comes from. You also count separation. You focus on first marriages. And that means that for recent decades, the estimates run from 40 to 50% divorce risk. I was on a radio show this week with somebody that, and it was basically a friendly interview. But he said, you know, you deal with statistics, and he had read some of these Christian authors who say, oh, don't believe that, it's actually only 20 to 25%. I said, people that say that divorce risk is only 20 to 25%, that's pure bunk. I put the surveys on my computer and I come up with 50% just with what I got. And that includes 36,000 people. Plus I read the census data. And I said it's lower now, but that's mostly because of cohabitation. So I'd say now it's between 40 and 50% depending on when you got married. And he said, well, I've been married since 1980 and we're still married. What will you say to me? I say, praise God that you're one of the lucky 50%. Okay. Now, the risk is not the same for all groups. And what I want to do is there's a lot of factors that affect your divorce risk that a premarital counselor or marital counselor wants to look at in terms of making evaluations of how best to help you. What I want to focus on are those things that are more controllable, that your church can do something about and that you can do something about. And I think I might have messed up my slides here, but let me just mention what some of these are. Okay. Your sexual and relational history, out of wedlock pregnancy, premarital, especially serial cohabitations, multiple sexual partners. Let me give you some statistics here. I took the 1996 through 2016 general social surveys. I pulled out only people who had ever been married and were now between the ages of 40 and 65. How many of them were divorced or separated at that time or said that their first marriage had ended in divorce? 53%. 53% of ever married people between the ages of 40 and 65 in 20 years of a survey done by the University of Chicago, not a chump outfit. 53% of them, that first marriage had ended in divorce or legal separation. For those who went to church regularly, 43%. For those who went to church weekly and never committed adultery, 38%. Those who committed adultery, 75%. And by the way, I wrote this down somewhere, and again, I keep finding I'm up here scrambling sometimes. So then I looked, and I broke it in males versus females. Those who said that they'd only ever had one sexual partner in their entire life. This means the only person they ever had sex with was the person they married. For males, 10%. For females, 16%. That's a heck of a lot better. That's not including anything else. That's a heck of a lot better than 53%. You've messed up your sexual history? Start where you are. Regular church involvement, I mentioned that. Premarital counseling. Brent, sending some business your way. By the way, a lot of churches will now not agree to marry any people that have not gone through evidence-based premarital counseling of at least 6 to 8 weeks and have a letter from the counselor, if it wasn't somebody employed by their church, certifying that. And I actually had to send a letter for one of my ex-students and her now husband to California because they wanted a letter from me before that I had completed 6 to 8 weeks of, in our case, I used the Prepare system, of professional premarital counseling before the pastor would agree to officiate at their wedding. And I put my money with my mouth as I've encouraged all my children to do the same thing. Mentor couples. By the way, if Beverly Heights Presbyterian Church does not have a mentor couple program, it's one of the easiest and best things they can do to help marriages. You take people with really good marriages and you train them to mentor other people. Supportive family and friend networks. Marrying within the faith. Dealing aggressively with spousal abuse. Dealing aggressively with substance abuse. Discouraging people from marrying who are not yet mature enough to handle the effects of marriage. Having a proactive program in place to help people, particularly men, with pornography. By the way, I was asked by one of the, I knew they're all blending together now, but I was asked by one of the radio interviewers what I thought about that. And I said, and I have to be careful here, but this is the overwhelming majority of young men getting married today have some of this in their past. The counselor should deal with that. Almost all young males have now interfaced with this, some more than others. Not all, but almost all. Healthy and regular sex lives, high levels of commitment to their marriages, and a high reluctance to embrace divorce. How do we apply these pictures of average marital risk, I'll finish on this, at the personal level? We see that some people are at a very high risk of getting divorced and others are not. Just as we do with life insurance and other areas of life, it's worthwhile to see which risk group we are in, as well as those we care for, so we can respond appropriately. However, even in the best situations, the real statistical probabilities to get divorced are great enough that any courting or engaged couple should do everything in their power to build a solid foundation for their life together. Moreover, the point is not just staying married, but to have a wonderful, God-honoring marriage. My goal for people is not that they just stay married, it's that they have a good marriage. Some people start with all the right advantages, and yet they fall short. Others begin their adult life with serious challenges such as poverty, childhood in a single-parent home, prior divorce, past drug problems, or even coming to Christ after having messed up sexually and experiencing consequences such as having a child or having a sexually transmitted disease. Yet I have seen folks with all these strikes against them go on to establish and enjoy fantastic marriages and families. The grace of God, humility and repentance for past sins, and walking in intelligent obedience to Christ within the embrace of His people, and a solid ministry-oriented, Bible-believing church is always going to be key to godly marriages, no matter the starting point. If we're going to have a good and lasting marriages, no matter where we start from, we're all going to get there pretty much the same way. Okay, thanks.